Determining the cost of a product can be tricky. There are three costs that make up product cost: direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. The direct costs are not too tricky. They're easy to trace, and we know exactly how much we use of each in the product and how much they cost. What can be difficult to determine is the manufacturing overhead. Assume you own a restaurant. You're determining the cost of each meal that you offer on your menu to make sure the price you're charging is appropriate. You certainly want to be covering the cost to make each meal, but you also may be charging too much. Let's start with our steak dinner. Our direct materials for this would be the ingredients that go into making the meal. We know what those are and how much each of those cost us. Our direct labor for this would be the time it takes to make the meal and how much we pay our chef for that time. Our manufacturing overhead for this involves all the other costs that go into making a meal. The amount we pay the waiter or waitress to take the food to the customer and wait on the customer throughout the meal. The amount of utilities, electricity and water used to make and serve the meal. A portion of the rent, insurance and taxes on the restaurant. A portion of repairs and maintenance on the kitchen equipment, a portion of the manager's salary, and so on and so on. There would be other overhead charges as well, but I think you get the point. How do we allocate these costs to that one steak dinner? We want to include those costs as they are part of making our product and should be included in our decision of how much to charge for the steak dinner. But how do we do that? One way a company can assign overhead costs is by using a predetermined overhead rate. This allows the company to come up with a rate for this overhead and apply it to each product as they're made. They don't have to try and figure out what portion of the light bill to apply to each steak dinner each night or what percentage of the supervisor's salary and the restaurant rent to apply to the steak dinner each night. This rate allows the company to use one rate to apply all overhead to each product. To come up with this rate, the company needs to determine something that is a good indicator of how the overhead is used and would be a good way to divide the overhead up among the products. This is called an allocation base because we will use it to allocate and apply the overhead. Let's go back to our restaurant. Remember some of those overhead charges that we were trying to apply to the cost of the meals? Lights and water in the restaurant, the rent for the restaurant, the supervisor's salary? There may be many options for an allocation base. We could use, say, the square footage of the building, or the number of seats in the restaurant, or the time it takes to make the steak, to name just a few. Once the company has selected the allocation base, they are just about ready to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. The company would calculate this rate at the beginning of each year or period. Since they're calculating this rate before they make anything, the company will need to use estimated numbers. They will estimate how much total overhead they will have for that period. They would also estimate the allocation base. To calculate the predetermined overhead rate, they would divide the total estimated overhead costs by the total estimated allocation base. Let's go back to our restaurant example. We add up all the overhead costs we estimate we will have for the coming year. We decide that direct labor hours, the time it takes to make the meals, is the best allocation base for our overhead. We estimate how much total direct labor hours we will have for the upcoming year. Assume our total estimated overhead costs come to $62,400 and our total estimated direct labor hours come to 10,400 hours. Our predetermined overhead rate would be $6 per direct labor hour. That means for every hour that is spent on making a meal, we would apply $6 in overhead costs to that meal. Or we can restate it to a per minute charge. This would be 10 cents per minute. If it takes 20 minutes to make a meal, a third of an hour, then we would apply $2 in overhead. This example uses one overhead rate for all products. However, a company may have multiple departments and decide using a different overhead rate for each department is a better way to apply overhead costs. You would calculate the overhead rates the same way, but we would calculate a rate for each individual department and apply it to each product as they move through each department in the production process. Now that we understand the predetermined overhead rate and how to apply it, we're ready to determine the overall product cost. Stay tuned!